Play this piano and I'll marry you," laughed the billionaire. But the immigrant played like a, "You have 5 seconds to get out of my way before I call security." Victoria Ashworth's voice echoed through the main hall of the luxurious Riverside Hotel like a whip cutting through the air. At 35, heiress to a hotel empire worth $3 billion, she had never been thwarted by someone like Miguel Santos. The accident had been simple. Miguel, working discreetly as a waiter during the annual charity event for Manhattan's elite, had bumped lightly into the table where Victoria was signing a donation check for the cameras. A drop of champagne splashed on her $15,000 Chanel dress. "Ma'am, please allow me to clean up." Miguel began in his careful English, still marked by the accent that gave away his Guatemalan origins. "Don't touch me." Victoria recoiled as if he were radioactive. "My God, do you really think you can walk around without watching your step?" At 28, Miguel Santos had crossed 3 borders to reach the United States 5 years earlier. He worked 2 jobs to support the family he had left behind and sent 80% of his salary to Guatemala every month. That night, she desperately needed to keep that temporary job at the event. "It was an accident, ma'am. Please let me pay for the cleanup." Victoria laughed, but there was nothing cheerful about the sound. It was pure venom. "Pay? With your waiter's salary? Darling, you wouldn't earn enough to pay even the price tag on this dress in a decade." The guests began to approach, attracted by the commotion. Wall Street executives, heiresses to centuries-old fortunes, influential politicians, all with their cell phones discreetly showing, ready to capture what promised to be a humiliating spectacle. Victoria noticed the growing audience, and her eyes flashed with a cruel thought. She had always loved being the center of attention, especially when it meant demonstrating her superiority over her inferiors. "You know what?" she said, raising her voice so that everyone could hear. "Since you want to impress me so much, how about a challenge?" She pointed to the Steinway grand piano that decorated the center of the room, a $200,000 piece that served more as a status symbol than a functional instrument. "See that piano? If you can play anything good, I'll marry you." The room erupted in cruel laughter. Victoria clapped her hands, delighted with her own cruelty. "Did you hear that, everyone? The immigrant is going to give us a concert." "Victoria, you're terrible," laughed Margaret Blackstone, a senator's wife, drying tears with laughter. "Poor boy." "Please," Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically, "I'm being generous. Giving him a chance to move up in life. Isn't that what they always say they want?" Miguel looked at the piano, then at Victoria, then at all those mocking faces. Something inside him stirred, a distant memory of little fingers on worn keys, of nights studying by candlelight because there was no money for electricity. For years, he had hidden this part of himself. In Guatemala, before extreme poverty forced his family to sell even their furniture, before crossing deserts and facing borders, he had been different. But here, in the United States, he was just another invisible immigrant. "Of course he won't make it," Victoria continued, savoring each word like expensive wine. "People like him only know how to serve food and clean toilets. Art, music, refined culture. That's for people like us, who have had a proper education." "Maybe we should stop that," muttered an older lady shyly. "The boy looks embarrassed." "Embarrassed?" Victoria laughed even louder. "Honey, he should be grateful for the attention. When was the last time someone like him had the chance to play a real instrument?" It was then that Miguel did something that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of lowering his head and retreating as Victoria had expected, he walked calmly towards the piano. His steps were measured, determined, and there was something about his posture that made some of the guests stop laughing. "Wait, are you really going to try?" Victoria asked, her confidence wavering for a split second as she saw the quiet determination in his eyes. "You made a promise," Miguel replied simply, his calm voice cutting through the laughter. "In front of everyone. In front of the cameras." The room fell silent for a moment. Victoria felt something cold run down her spine, not fear, but the first nagging feeling that perhaps she had underestimated this man. There was something in his eyes, a serenity that didn't match the humiliating situation. "Very well," she said, regaining her composure and her mischievous smile. "But when you fail miserably, and you will, I want you to apologize in front of everyone for having wasted our time." As Miguel approached the instrument, his hands trembled slightly, but it wasn't fear that made those hands tremble. It was something much more powerful, the anticipation of someone who is about to completely rewrite the narrative of their own life. No one in the hall could have imagined that they were about to witness something that would not only change that night, but question everything they thought they knew about talent, dignity, and the true meaning of nobility. If this story of prejudice and overcoming is touching your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what's about to happen will prove that sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply showing the world who you really are. Miguel approached the Steinway with measured steps, completely ignoring the laughter that echoed around him. Victoria watched his every move with a smile that could cut glass, clearly relishing what she considered her anticipated victory. "Wait a minute," she said, raising her hand dramatically. "Before we start this comedy, how about we make this more interesting?" Victoria opened her Hermes bag and took out an Italian leather wallet stuffed with bills. $1,000 if you can play a whole song without making a mistake, she announced, waving the money in the air as if it were a carrot for a donkey. The guests murmured amongst themselves, some laughing at the situation. "Victoria, you're being too cruel," whispered Margaret Blackstone, but her voice carried more amusement than real reproach. "Cruel?" Victoria feigned indignation. "I'm offering him more money than he probably earns in a month. It's pure charity." Miguel stopped in front of the piano, his hands resting lightly on the closed lid. For a moment his eyes closed, and something far away, a memory of cold nights in a small house in Quetzaltenango, where a worn upright piano took up most of the living room. "Actually," Victoria continued, her voice taking on an even more venomous tone, "how about $2,000? But if you fail, and we know you will, you have to get down on your knees here in front of everyone and apologize for wasting our time." The silence that followed was different from the previous laughter. Some guests seemed uncomfortable with the explicit cruelty of the proposal. Miguel opened his eyes and looked directly at Victoria. "What if I can play, ma'am?" His voice was calm, but there was something new in it, a quiet authority that made Victoria hesitate for a split second. "Impossible," she replied quickly, masking her momentary insecurity with more arrogance. "But if by some divine miracle you manage to play something that isn't a complete disaster, I'll double the bet. $4,000. What Victoria didn't know was that she was talking to someone who had played in one of Guatemala's leading opera houses before the age of 18. Miguel Santos wasn't just an immigrant looking for opportunities. He was a musical prodigy who had abandoned a scholarship at the Juilliard School when his family lost everything in a devastating flood. The decision to emigrate to the United States wasn't just about financial survival. It was about sacrifice. Every dollar he sent home kept his 3 younger siblings in school, paid for their diabetic father's medication, and helped rebuild the small music school he himself had attended as a child. $4,000, Miguel repeated slowly, as if he were calculating how many months' remittance that represented for the family. "And if I play better than any professional pianist you've ever heard?" The question caught Victoria completely off guard. She expected pleading, nervousness, perhaps an excuse to get out of the situation. She wasn't expecting a confident negotiation. "Better than a professional," she laughed, but the sound was forced now. "Darling, you can't even hold a fork properly, let alone play the piano like a professional." Some of the guests looked at each other. Cruelty was pushing the boundaries of what they considered acceptable entertainment, even by their elitist standards. Miguel opened the piano lid. The keys gleamed under the light of the chandeliers, each one perfectly tuned and cared for. For 5 years, he had avoided playing any instrument. Music reminded him too much of what he had lost, of the dreams he had sacrificed on the altar of family responsibility. But at that moment, in front of that woman who treated him as if he were less than human, something inside him flared up. It wasn't just anger, it was pride. The pride of someone who knew exactly who they were, even when forced to pretend to be something else. "You know what bothers me most about people like you?" Victoria continued, unable to stop her torrent of venom. "You come here thinking you deserve the same as us. But the truth is simple, some were born to serve, others to be served. It's the natural order of things." With each word, Miguel's fingers moved unconsciously over the keys, as if they were remembering music he thought he had forgotten. Rachmaninoff, Chopin, Liszt, composers he had mastered before he was even 17. "The worst thing," she continued, "is this arrogance of believing that they can rise above their condition. As if talent were more important than lineage, proper education, birthplace." It was then that Miguel smiled. It wasn't a smile of nervousness or submission. It was the smile of someone who had just decided to reveal a secret kept for years. A smile that made some of the more observant guests realize that perhaps they had seriously underestimated this man. "You're right about one thing," Miguel said, adjusting the height of the stool with the precision of someone who had made that move thousands of times. "Talent is something you're born with. But what really separates the great artists from the mediocre ones isn't where they come from, it's what they're willing to sacrifice for their art." Victoria felt a chill run up her spine. There was something about Miguel's posture, the way his hands were positioned on the keys, that didn't match the image of the clumsy waiter she had humiliated minutes before. Every insult she had uttered was fueling something powerful inside him, not just indignation, but a silent determination to show her and everyone present the true meaning of the word talent. And when her hands finally touched the first keys, even those who scoffed the most began to realize that they were about to witness something that would completely redefine their conceptions of class, culture, and true excellence. Miguel's hands hovered over the keys for a few seconds that seemed eternal. In that charged silence, something extraordinary was happening, not only in the hall, but especially in the mind of the man Victoria had completely underestimated. While the guests whispered among themselves, betting on how quickly that pathetic spectacle would end, Miguel closed his eyes and allowed a specific memory to invade him. Quetzaltenango, Guatemala, 15 years ago. A 13-year-old boy playing on a worn-out upright piano, under the strict guidance of Maestro Herrera, who had studied at the Paris Conservatoire. "Miguel," the old maestro's voice echoed in his mind, "when you play for people who doubt you, remember, don't play to convince them. Play to remind yourself who you really are." Maestro Herrera had seen something special in that boy from the suburbs. Something so extraordinary that he had dedicated 5 years of his life to training him for free, preparing him for international auditions that could change everything. Miguel had been accepted to the Juilliard School on a full scholarship at the age of 17, a feat that fewer than 20 Latinos achieve every decade. But then came the floods of 2008. His house, the music school, his scholarship documents, everything was washed away. And with them, apparently, his dreams. "Are you waiting for divine inspiration?" Victoria mocked, breaking Miguel's trance. "Because I can assure you that God doesn't waste miracles on people like you." The laughter echoed again, but this time Miguel smiled. It was the smile of someone who had just made an irreversible decision. That's when a female voice cut through the laughter. "Señor Miguel." Everyone turned to see Carmen Rodriguez, the hotel's event supervisor, a woman in her 50s who had been working there for 15 years. She had been watching the whole scene with growing discomfort. "Carmen, don't pry," Victoria growled. "That's none of your business." But Carmen completely ignored Victoria and walked straight up to Miguel. "Mr. Miguel," she repeated, her voice carrying something that made several guests pay attention. "The lady who recommended you to me to work here, she mentioned that you had studied music." The room fell silent. Victoria felt a chill run down her spine. "What lady?" asked Margaret Blackstone, curious. Carmen smiled. "Professor Helena Vasquez, from the Manhattan School of Music. She said Miguel was one of the most promising talents she'd come across in 20 years of teaching." The lie came out so naturally that even Miguel blinked in surprise. Carmen had made it up on the spot, but there was something in her eyes, a fierce determination to protect someone she saw being unfairly humiliated. "That's ridiculous," Victoria protested, but her voice sounded less confident now. "If he was really talented, what would he be doing serving drinks?" "Sometimes," Miguel replied calmly, finally speaking, "people make sacrifices that others can't understand." His hands positioned themselves on the keys with a precision that made some of the musicians present, there were 3 violinists and a cellist among the guests, lean forward intrigued. "You know," Miguel continued, his voice gaining a quiet authority, "for years I avoided pianos. They reminded me of everything I had lost. But today, in this moment, I realized that perhaps I was protected for exactly this moment." Victoria tried to laugh, but the sound came out forced. There was something about Miguel's posture, the way his fingers curved naturally over the keys, that didn't match the image of the clumsy immigrant she had humiliated. "Well," she said, trying to regain control, "enough theater. Just play that song so we can get this over with." Miguel nodded and put his fingers in the starting position. For a moment, the room was in absolute suspense. Then, without any warning or warm-up, he attacked the first notes of one of the most technically challenging compositions in the classical repertoire, Liszt's La Campanella. The first notes came out like crystal-clear raindrops, each one perfectly articulated. Some guests exchanged surprised glances. This was definitely not what they expected from a nervous waiter. Carmen watched with a growing smile, realizing that her intuition about Miguel had been correct. There was something special about him, something she had noticed during the 5 years they had worked together. The way he unconsciously drummed out complex rhythms while cleaning tables, the way his eyes lit up when classical music played on the hotel sound system. Victoria felt her stomach contract. The notes coming out of the piano weren't just correct, they were masterful. Each musical phrase was executed with a naturalness that only came from years of rigorous training. But what really made some guests straighten up in their chairs was when Miguel began to speed up the tempo, his hands flying over the keys in passages that required not just technique, but world-class artistry. "My God," muttered one of the violinists present, "is he playing that from memory?" The question echoed quietly among the musicians, but loud enough for Victoria to hear. She looked around, seeing expressions of growing fascination replacing the mocking smiles of minutes before. Miguel was just beginning his real performance, and as his hands danced over the keys with a mastery that would leave even professional musicians impressed, a terrifying realization began to form in Victoria's mind. She had challenged exactly the wrong person. What none of those present could have imagined was that this performance was just the warm-up, and that the real show was about to begin, revealing not only the extraordinary talent that Miguel had hidden for years, but also a lesson about judgment and humility that no one in that hall would ever forget. The melody was haunting melancholic, but with an underlying strength that spoke of struggle, sacrifice, and undestroyed hope. The performance of Liszt's La Campanella that came out of Miguel's hands wasn't just technically perfect, it was transcendent. Every note cascaded through the hall like crystal-clear water, and when he reached the famous octave jumps that make professional pianists tremble with nervousness, he executed them with an ease that bordered on the supernatural. Victoria felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath her feet. This couldn't be happening. The immigrant waiter she had humiliated minutes before was playing with a mastery she had only witnessed in Carnegie Hall. "Impossible," she muttered, but her voice was swallowed up by the applause that was already echoing around the hall. Miguel finished the first piece with a cadence that made the chandeliers vibrate. Without lifting his eyes from the piano, without dramatic pauses, he segued straight into Chopin's Ballade No. 1 inch, a composition that required not only technique, but emotional depth that few pianists could convey. "Mr. Miguel," Carmen approached during a softer interlude, her voice charged with genuine emotion. "Can I ask you a question?" Miguel nodded, his hands continuing to dance over the keys. "The Juilliard School. Did you really study there?" The room fell deathly silent. Even Victoria stopped trying to find a logical explanation for what she was witnessing. Miguel smiled, his fingers executing a particularly complex passage without even looking at the keys. "I was accepted on a full scholarship at 17. First person in my family to leave Guatemala." A collective murmur ran through the guests. Juilliard School, the most prestigious music school in the world. Victoria felt nausea rising in her throat. "Then why?" Margaret Blackstone began, but couldn't finish the question. "Why am I here serving drinks?" Miguel added, his music gaining an emotional intensity that made some people wipe tears from their eyes. "Because sometimes life teaches us that there are things more important than our own dreams." Then a young man in the crowd raised his cell phone. "Man, everyone needs to see this." He had started broadcasting live on Instagram. Victoria realized what was happening and felt pure panic. "No, don't do that. Stop filming." But it was too late. Other guests had already pulled out their phones. The hashtag immigrant virtuoso started appearing in real time on social media, accompanied by hashtag justice for Miguel and hashtag billionaire shame. "I know you," said an older man, approaching the piano. Victoria recognized him as Richard Morrison, music critic for the New York Times. "You're Miguel Santos, the Guatemalan prodigy who disappeared years ago. I wrote about your audition in 2019. Victoria's blood ran completely cold. He wasn't just a talented waiter, he was an internationally recognized musician who had simply disappeared from the world stage. "Do you remember the article?" Morrison continued, pulling out his cell phone. The headline was, "Young Guatemalan could be the next Horowitz." "I was at his audition at Lincoln Center." Miguel nodded, transitioning to a composition of his own that no one had heard before. "This piece," he said quietly as he played, I've dedicated the last 5 years to a cause greater than my career. My family, my community. Sometimes sacrifice is worth more than personal glory. 50,000 views in 5 minutes, shouted the young man broadcasting on Instagram. Guys, it's blowing up. 100,000 now. Victoria tried desperately to regain control, but her voice came out shaky. Okay, so you know how to play. That doesn't change the fact that you're just an immigrant who abandoned an international career to look after his family. Morrison interrupted, her eyes blazing with journalistic indignation. Ma'am, do you have any idea who you've just humiliated? Carmen approached Victoria, this time without any deference. Mrs. Victoria, Mr. Miguel sends $2,000 a month to a music school he founded in Guatemala. I know because I help him with the bank transfers. 200,000 views, someone announced. That's viral. Victoria watched in absolute horror as her deliberate humiliation turned into an epic PR disaster. The comments on the live streams were scrolling faster than she could read, but the words she managed to capture made her feel physically sick. That woman is disgusting. Miguel is a hero. What a disgusting racist. Boycott her hotels. What you've done, Miguel said, finishing his original composition and turning to face her for the first time since he started playing, is remind me of who I really am. And for that, I thank you. His voice was calm, but carried a dignity that made Victoria physically recoil. There was no cruel triumph in his eyes, just an unwavering serenity that made her feel smaller than an insect. Morrison was typing furiously into his phone. Ms. Ashworth, I would like an official statement about your comments tonight. They will be tomorrow's headline. 300,000 views. The young man was practically shouting. 500,000. Guys, you're making history. Carmen approached Victoria with an expression that mixed professional pity and personal satisfaction. Ms. Victoria, the hotel's general manager would like to speak to you urgently. It seems that some important guests are canceling their reservations and demanding refunds after seeing the videos online. We also have journalists arriving in the lobby, added a hotel employee who had appeared discreetly. TMZ, CNN, some locals. They all want a statement. Victoria felt like she was in free fall. Her reputation, painstakingly built up over decades, was crumbling in real time, broadcast live to millions of people around the world. Miguel stood up from the piano bench for the first time in 40 minutes. When he addressed Victoria, there was no cruel triumph in his posture, only an unshakable dignity that transformed his victory into something transcendent. Ms. Victoria, he said calmly, extending his hand in a gesture of forgiveness that was captured by dozens of cameras, thank you for reminding me of who I really am. Sometimes we need to lose ourselves completely in order to find ourselves again. As the applause continued and the cameras captured every moment of that extraordinary transformation, a question hung in the air laden with emotion and redemption. Was it possible that that night of humiliation and revelation could teach something profound about dignity, talent, and a person's true worth? Or can some lessons about humanity only be learned when it's too late to ask for sincere forgiveness? 6 months after that night at the Riverside Hotel, Miguel Santos was back on stage at Lincoln Center, but this time not as a young aspirant desperate for an opportunity. He was there as principal soloist of the newly created International Young Talent Orchestra, a project that he himself had conceived and that Victoria Ashworth had fully funded. The irony didn't go unnoticed by anyone. The woman who had publicly humiliated him now sat in the front row, applauding more enthusiastically than any other spectator. Victoria's transformation had been as dramatic as it had been unexpected. I never imagined that the worst night of my life would become the catalyst for the best decision I've ever made, she had told the New York Times 2 weeks after the viral incident. Miguel didn't just teach me about music, he taught me about humanity. The video of that night in the hotel had surpassed 50 million views, becoming one of the most documented cases of instant justice in the history of social media. But the consequences went far beyond the online numbers. 3 days after the viral performance, Victoria had lost contracts from 3 major hotel partners, who canceled deals citing incompatible corporate values. Her own board had called an emergency meeting, questioning her ability to represent the family brand. It was the first time in 35 years that I had been forced to account for my actions, Victoria admitted in a later interview. And I realized that I didn't like the person I had become. Miguel, on the other hand, had received more than 200 offers to perform around the world. Conservatories in Europe, opera houses in Asia, symphony orchestras in the Americas, they all wanted to work with the immigrant pianist who touched the heart of the world. But the most impactful decision came when Victoria approached him personally, a week after the incident, in the modest apartment in Queens where Miguel lived with 2 other Guatemalan immigrants. "I want to finance your studies," she had said, sitting uncomfortably in the plastic chair that served as the main piece of furniture in the living room. "Not out of pity, but because I recognize talent when I see it. And because I need to do something right with the money I've inherited." The initial proposal was simple. Victoria would pay for Miguel to resume his studies at the Juilliard School and cover all his family's expenses in Guatemala. In return, Miguel would help her create a foundation dedicated to discovering and supporting musical talent in underprivileged communities around the world. "At first I thought it was guilt," Miguel explained to critic Richard Morrison, who had been following the story for months. "But then I realized it was something deeper. Victoria was genuinely trying to redeem herself, and I had the opportunity to turn my suffering into something that could help hundreds of other people." The Santos Ashworth Foundation was officially launched 3 months later, with an initial investment of $10 million. Its first project was to build 5 music schools in rural communities in Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Carmen Rodriguez, who had defended Miguel on that fateful night, was hired as the foundation's operational director. Her intuition about Miguel's special character had proved correct in an extraordinary way. "When I saw that woman humiliating Miguel, I knew I was witnessing something important," Carmen recalled during an interview. "Not just injustice, but the opportunity for someone special to show the world what he was capable of." Critic Richard Morrison had published a series of 3 articles about their transformation, entitled "When Humiliation Becomes Redemption." The last article ended with a profound observation. In an age of cancellations and digital revenge, Miguel Santos and Victoria Ashworth have proved that there is a different path, the path of mutual transformation through art and forgiveness. Victoria had lost many of her old friends from New York's elite, but gained something much more valuable: purpose. Her old friends, like Margaret Blackstone, avoided her at social events, whispering about her obsession with charity and her inappropriate friendship with the immigrant. But Victoria had discovered that she didn't miss that world. She spent her weekends visiting music schools in outlying neighborhoods, learning the names and stories of dozens of young talents she would previously have considered invisible. Miguel, meanwhile, had become a global symbol of perseverance and dignity. His TED Talk, "The Piano That Changed 2 Lives," had been watched by more than 15 million people. Universities around the world invited him to give lectures on overcoming and art as a tool for social justice. But perhaps the most profound transformation took place that night at Lincoln Center, 6 months later. At the end of his performance, an original composition dedicated to the sacrificed dreams that find new life through compassion, Miguel did something unexpected. He invited Victoria on stage. "This woman," he said into the microphone, his voice echoing through the packed room, "taught me that true courage lies not in never falling, but in getting up transformed after the fall." Victoria took to the stage with tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. The two embraced in front of 2,800 people, and the ovation that followed lasted more than 5 minutes. At that moment, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something rare, proof that people can change, that injustices can be transformed into opportunities for growth, and that sometimes the best stories are those where there are no villains at the end, just human beings who have learned to be better. The foundation continues to grow and has already supported more than 500 young musicians in vulnerable situations. Miguel divides his time between international performances and visits to the foundation schools, always reminding the students that talent knows no borders or social classes. Victoria, for her part, has discovered that true wealth does not lie in inheriting empires, but in building legacies that survive the generations. She still runs the family business, but now with a completely different perspective on what leadership and social responsibility mean. If this story of transformation and redemption has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true revenge is not about destroying those who hurt us, but about building something so beautiful that it transforms even our oppressors into allies of the justice we always deserve.